There is a specific kind of silence that fills a room right after someone destroys your trust completely. It is not a peaceful silence. It is not the comfortable kind you share with someone you love on a Sunday morning. It is hollow and cold, and it carries the distinct weight of every lie you were too naive to question. I know that silence intimately now. I lived inside it for 3 years, before I finally understood what it was telling me. People talk about toxic families the way they talk about bad weather. Unfortunate, inconvenient, something you endure until it passes. Nobody tells you that some storms do not pass. Some storms are not weather at all. Some storms are deliberate, carefully engineered by people who smile at your wedding and cry at your mother's funeral and refill your coffee cup at Sunday dinners, while quietly calculating exactly how much you are worth to them and exactly how they plan to take it. I was a real estate attorney when I married my husband Daniel. I had spent 7 years building a career on the precise and careful reading of documents, on finding the language buried in contracts that other people missed, on understanding that what a person writes down and signs their name to is the truest version of who they actually are. I was good at my job. I was methodical and thorough, and I genuinely loved the work. I thought that skill set made me smart about people too. I was wrong. Being good at reading documents does not protect you from the people who love you. It does not protect you from the faces you trust so completely that you stop reading them altogether. I met Daniel at a charity fundraiser in Atlanta when I was 28. He was tall and warm, and he laughed easily, and he brought me coffee exactly the way I liked it the second time we ever had breakfast together. Small things matter when you are falling in love. You catalog them without realizing it. The way he held doors open without making a performance of it. The way he called his mother every Sunday. That last one I noted as a good sign. I was very foolish. His mother Margaret was elegant in the way that certain Southern women make into an art form, perfectly pressed linen, a specific shade of blonde that required serious maintenance to look effortless. She had opinions about everything and delivered them with a smile so practiced it looked genuine even when it wasn't. The first time she hugged me, she said, "We are so happy Daniel finally found someone sensible," and I thanked her because I did not yet understand that she was not complimenting me. She was establishing that Daniel's previous choices had been her business to evaluate, and that mine would be too. My grandmother passed away 8 months after Daniel and I got married. She left me her house. It was a 3-bedroom Craftsman indicator that she had owned outright for 40 years, fully paid off, sitting on a corner lot that had appreciated quietly and significantly over the decades. The property was worth just under $800,000 by the time it came to me. My grandmother had been careful with her money her entire life, had never trusted banks entirely, and had made very sure through her estate attorney that the house came to me personally, not to me and my spouse jointly. She had met Daniel. She had been polite about it. She had also been a woman who lived long enough to know things she did not always say out loud. I grieved my grandmother deeply. She had raised me for 3 years after my parents' car accident when I was 9, and even after my aunt took over primary custody, my grandmother had remained the most consistent and loving presence in my life. Losing her guttered something in me that I am still learning to rebuild. Daniel was present during the funeral. He held my hand. He said the right things. What I did not know at the time was that while I was grieving, his mother and his sister were having a very different kind of conversation about my grandmother's house. My sister-in-law Renata was 4 years younger than Daniel and had never fully accepted that her brother's attention was no longer entirely hers to command. She was the kind of woman who phrased cruelty as concern and called it honesty. She had told me twice in the first year of my marriage that I worked too much, and both times she said it with a sympathetic tilt of her head that made it impossible to respond to without looking defensive. She and Margaret were extremely close. They spoke every day. They finished each other's sentences at family dinners and exchanged looks across tables that contained entire conversations I was not invited into. About 4 months after my grandmother passed, Daniel came home one evening with a particular energy I did not immediately recognize. He was restless and over-explaining, and he kept touching the back of his neck, which I had noticed was a habit he had when he was uncomfortable. He told me that his mother had mentioned casually, as an idea that, since we were talking about starting a family, it might make practical sense to put the Decatur property into a joint family trust. For future planning purposes. For simplicity. for the children we did not yet have. I told him calmly that the property was mine personally, that my grandmother had been intentional about that, and that I had no plans to restructure the ownership. He nodded. He said, of course. He said he understood. He said he would let his mother know. I believed him completely, which is something I have had to spend considerable time forgiving myself for. I found out what had actually been happening on a Tuesday afternoon in March, and I found out not because someone told me but because I was doing exactly what I had been trained to do. I was reviewing documents. I had decided to refinance a small equity line on the Decatur property to fund some renovation work, and I had contacted the county recorder's office to pull the current deed as a matter of routine. What came back stopped me cold in my chair. The property was no longer titled solely in my name. According to the document on my screen, which bore a notarization date of 6 weeks prior, ownership of the property had been transferred into a family trust. The Margaret and Daniel Whitfield Family Trust, with Margaret listed as the primary trustee. My signature was on that document. I had not signed that document. I sat very still for a long time. I am not sure how long. I remember the particular quality of the afternoon light through my office window. I remember my assistant knocking and me telling her I was on a call. I pulled up the document, and I looked at my signature, and I looked at it again, and I felt something settle into place inside me that I can only describe as a cold, very clear, very complete understanding. This had not been an accident. This had not been a miscommunication. This was a calculated theft, executed by people who had watched me grieve my grandmother and decided that her death was an opportunity. I did not call Daniel. I want to be precise about the order of what I did because it matters. I called my colleague Marcus, who handled fraud cases, and I described what I was looking at without telling him whose names were on the document. He told me what I already knew from my own training. This was deed fraud. This was forgery. This was a felony. I thanked him and I ended the call, and then I sat with what I knew for another hour before I did anything else. The notarization was the piece that told me exactly how deep this went. For that document to have been notarized with a forged signature, someone had either bribed or manipulated a notary, or the notary was complicit. I had a friend at the state attorney's office. I had 7 years of professional contacts in the Atlanta legal and real estate community. I had every tool I needed. But I was also a wife sitting in an office realizing that the people who had eaten at her table and called her family had been carefully, methodically stealing from her. I went home that evening and I cooked dinner. This is the part that people find difficult to understand when I tell them the story. I went home and I cooked pasta and I opened a bottle of wine and I asked Daniel about his day. He told me about a meeting that had run long. He poured himself a glass. He kissed me on the cheek. I watched his face across the dinner table and I looked for the thing I had missed. The particular texture of a person who knows he is living a lie. And I found it in the small ways he avoided holding my gaze for more than a few seconds at a time. After dinner, I told him I had been reviewing documents related to the Decatur property and asked him if there was anything he wanted to tell me. The color changed in his face immediately. He set down his glass. He started with the word look, which is a word people use when they have already decided that what they are about to say is something you should accept, rather than something they should apologize for. He said his mother had only been trying to protect the family's financial future. He said it was complicated. He said she had explained to him that in certain estate situations it made sense to consolidate assets before a pregnancy, and that he had trusted her judgment because she had always handled the family's financial matters. He said my signature had been necessary for the process and that he had assumed his mother had handled it properly. I asked him if he had seen the document before it was filed. He said he had seen something but he hadn't read it carefully because he trusted his mother. I asked him if he understood that my signature on a legal document that I did not personally sign constituted forgery. He said he was sure there was a reasonable explanation. He said I was being aggressive. He said maybe I should talk to his mother before I made any assumptions. I told him I had already spoken to a colleague in fraud litigation and that I was going to take the next 24 hours to decide how I wanted to proceed. He spent those 24 hours on the phone with his mother. I know this because I could hear him in the garage at 11 at night speaking in the careful low voice he used when he did not want me to hear what he was saying. I met Margaret and Renata the following afternoon at Margaret's house because they requested it and because I wanted to see them in person when I told them what I knew. Margaret had prepared tea. Renata was sitting on the settee with her ankles crossed like they were about to discuss a bridal shower. Margaret opened by telling me that she understood I had some concerns, and that she wanted to reassure me that everything had been done with the family's best interests at heart. I let her finish. I let Renata nod along. I let the whole performance run to its natural end. Then I put a folder on the coffee table and I opened it and I walked them through exactly what I had found, exactly what it constituted under Georgia law, and exactly what the range of criminal exposure looked like for the individuals involved. Margaret's expression did not change for the first 30 seconds, which told me she had prepared for this conversation in some form. Then her jaw tightened. She told me I was being dramatic. She told me I had never properly understood how this family operated. She told me that Daniel had agreed to all of this and that if I had a problem with it, I should take it up with my husband instead of coming into her home making accusations. Renata said nothing for most of this. Then she said that I had always been cold and difficult and that Daniel deserved someone who put family first. She said that my grandmother's property should have come to the family anyway, because that was how family worked. She said it with such complete conviction that I understood she had rehearsed it, that she had told herself this story so many times it had become true for her. I closed the folder. I told them I was going to give them one opportunity to reverse the fraudulent transfer voluntarily and cooperate fully with an accounting of what had been done and who had been involved. I told them that if they chose not to take that opportunity, I would be filing a complaint with the Fulton County District Attorney's Office and the Georgia Real Estate Commission by the end of the week, and I would be pursuing every civil remedy available to me simultaneously. I told them this without raising my voice. I told them this the way I would tell a client about the terms of a contract, because that is what it was. Those were the terms. Margaret told me I would regret this. She used the word regret in the way that people use it when they mean it as a threat. I picked up my folder. I thanked her for the tea that I had not touched. I left. Daniel was waiting at our house when I got home. He had clearly spoken to his mother again. He was angry in the brittle, defensive way of someone who knows they are wrong and is hoping that aggression will work where logic can't. He told me I had embarrassed him. He told me his mother was devastated. He told me that I was choosing my career over my marriage. He told me that if I filed that complaint, he did not know what our future looked like. I asked him what he thought our future looked like right now. He didn't answer. He went upstairs. I sat in the kitchen, and I called my mother's sister, my Aunt Carol, who had raised me after my grandmother took the first shift, and I told her what had happened. She did not say much. She had met Margaret at my wedding, and she had said afterward, very quietly, that I should keep my personal financial documents somewhere Margaret could not access them. I had filed that comment away as family tension, as one older woman's instinct about another, and I had not acted on it the way I should have. My aunt simply said, "Tell me what you need." That was the first time I cried since finding the document. I moved out of our house that weekend. I had already consulted a divorce attorney on Friday morning, the same day I filed the fraud complaint with the DA's office. I stayed with my aunt for 2 weeks while my attorney began the process, and while I continued to build the evidentiary record for the fraud case. The notary turned out to be a woman who had done work for Margaret's church community for years. When investigators interviewed her, she initially claimed the signature had been genuine, but the forensic document examiner's report was unambiguous. She reversed her statement within a week. The thing about committing fraud in a real estate document in Georgia is that the paper trail is extensive and permanent. Every filing, every transfer, every notarization leaves a record in the county system. Margaret had assumed, I think, that I would either not notice or would eventually accept the situation to preserve my marriage. She had not fully calculated what it meant that her daughter-in-law spent her professional life reading exactly these kinds of documents and exactly these kinds of records. She had seen my career as something I did to fill time before the real business of being a Whitfield wife began. She had fundamentally misunderstood who I was, and that misunderstanding was the foundation of every mistake she made. The investigation took several months. During that time, Daniel filed a response to my divorce petition that was largely drafted by his mother's attorney, which told me everything I needed to know about the ongoing nature of that relationship. He did not contest the property. His own attorney had apparently advised him that contesting ownership of a property that was the subject of an active fraud investigation, where his wife was the victim, would be extraordinarily inadvisable. He agreed to the settlement terms with less resistance than I expected, which I interpreted not as remorse but as the practical response of a man who had finally encountered a situation he could not get his mother to manage for him. I want to be honest about Daniel because I think honesty is important even when it is inconvenient. He was not purely malicious. He was something almost worse, which is profoundly and consistently passive. He had spent his entire adult life allowing his mother to make decisions that should have been his to make, and he had so thoroughly outsourced his own moral judgment to her that by the time he found himself in the middle of a felony fraud case involving his wife, he was genuinely disoriented. He knew what had happened was wrong. I saw that on his face multiple times during the divorce proceedings. He simply had no framework for taking responsibility for it, because taking responsibility for things had never been required of him before. He is living in a rented apartment in Marietta now. His mother calls him every Sunday. I imagine it is a smaller life than he expected. I find I have very little feeling about it either way. Margaret was indicted on 2 counts of felony deed fraud and 1 count of forgery in the first degree. Renata, who investigators determined had helped coordinate the notary arrangement, was charged as a co-conspirator. Margaret's attorney negotiated a plea agreement that resulted in 5 years of probation, significant fines, and a permanent bar from serving as a trustee or executor in any Georgia estate proceeding for the remainder of her life. It was not the outcome I might have written for her if I were writing fiction, but it was the outcome the evidence supported and the outcome the law provided, and I have learned to make my peace with the distance between justice and satisfaction. What I did not expect, in all of it, was how clearly I would be able to see my own life after everything was removed from it. When you are inside a marriage and a family structure, even a deeply wrong one, it has its own gravity. It bends your perception of normal. I had told myself that Daniel's passivity was a manageable quality, that Margaret's controlling nature was a personality trait I could navigate, that the friction I felt in that family was simply the ordinary friction of building a life with someone different from yourself. I had minimized so much that I had lost accurate calibration of my own experience. The house in Decatur is mine. I had it renovated. I live there now with my dog, a golden retriever named Sable that I got 6 months after the divorce was finalized, and with the understanding that every room in that house is exactly what I want it to be. I took a framed photograph of my grandmother from storage and put it on the mantelpiece in the living room, the room that has the original hardwood floors she put in herself in 1987. I talk to her photograph sometimes, which I know is something only people who have loved someone deeply and lost them would understand without explanation. My practice has grown. I have 3 associates now, and we specialize in real estate fraud and estate litigation, which is a specialty I came to through necessity and have stayed in because it turns out I am exceptionally good at it and because the work genuinely matters. Every week I talk to people who have been taken advantage of in exactly the kinds of ways I was. People who trusted family members with documents they did not read carefully enough, people who signed things without fully understanding what they were signing, people who lost property that should have been theirs because someone exploited their grief or their trust or their love. I know precisely what it feels like to sit across from someone and realize that the story you believed about your life was a careful construction built to serve someone else's agenda. I know it, and that knowledge makes me very good at what I do. I am not telling you this story because I want your sympathy, though I understand if you feel it. I am telling you this story because the lesson inside it is one I wish someone had given me clearly a long time ago, before I learned it the hard way. There is a specific kind of manipulation that operates through love. It uses your loyalty and your grief and your desire to believe the best about people as its primary instruments. It is patient, it is quiet, it does not announce itself. It sits at your dinner table and calls your children by the names you have not yet chosen, and it waits for the moment you are most vulnerable, and then it moves. The only protection against it is precisely the thing that loving someone tempts you to abandon, which is the clear, careful, unsentimental reading of what is actually happening in front of you. My grandmother taught me to read documents before she taught me almost anything else. She would put a piece of paper in front of me at her kitchen table and she would say, "Sophie, what does this actually say? Not what you hope it says." Not what they told you it says. What does it actually say? I thought she was teaching me to be a lawyer. She was teaching me to be a person who could not be robbed in the dark. I used that lesson every day. I used it to save my property and my future and the legacy my grandmother left for me. I am no longer the woman who sat across a dinner table, cataloging small kindnesses and filing away warnings as family tension. I read everything now. I read it carefully, and I read it completely, and I trust what the document says over what anyone tells me it means. That discipline saved my house. More importantly, it saved the version of myself I want my future children to inherit. I stood in my backyard last spring on a Saturday morning while Sable chased something through the azalea bushes my grandmother planted along the back fence, and I looked at the house she left me, and I thought about what it had cost to keep it and what it would have cost to lose it. Not the money, though the money matters. The continuity. The specific and irreplaceable thread of a person's love made permanent in wood and glass and brick, in a corner lot on a street in Decatur, that my grandmother chose deliberately because the light came through the kitchen windows exactly right in the morning. Some things cannot be appraised. Some things you fight for not because they are worth a dollar amount, but because they are worth everything that number cannot measure. The people who tried to take it from me are living in the consequences of their choices. I did not put them there out of spite. I put them there because the law exists precisely for this purpose and because doing nothing would have made me complicit in my own loss. There is no version of that story where I stay quiet and come out whole on the other side. There is no love deep enough to justify the kind of surrender that asks you to look away from your own forged signature and call it family. I turned away from the azaleas and went back inside, and I made coffee in the kitchen with the good morning light. And I stood at the counter my grandmother stood at for 40 years, and I drank it slowly. The house was quiet. It was mine. It had always been meant to be mine, and now it simply was, without complication and without condition, and the peace inside that quiet was the most valuable thing I have ever acquired in my professional or personal life. I built nothing to punish anyone. I built this because I am my grandmother's granddaughter, and she did not raise me to abandon what is mine. I am a woman who reads every document to its final clause, and I can tell you with absolute professional certainty that the terms of my own life now are exactly what I negotiated them to be. I would not change a single line. Thank you for spending this time with me and with this story. If it resonated with you in any way, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for something that was rightfully yours against people who expected you to stay quiet? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reached you at a moment when you needed to hear it, please give it a like and subscribe to Mending Stories for more. Your presence here matters more than you know. Take care of yourself, read everything carefully, and never let anyone convince you that what you can see with your own eyes is not actually there.